Hey you guys, my name is Alex and I'm a tutor here at Chegg Tutors. I'm also a junior American Studies major at Yale University, and mostly I tutor in American literature and film. However, today I'm going to be talking about the sociological term institutionalized racism. So everyone is probably familiar with the term racism. However, a lot of people get hung up with this term institutionalized. So when we say institutionalized, we're talking about formal institutions or governing bodies that have power socially, culturally, politically in a society. And I'm mostly going to speak about institutionalized racism in the United States because that's more my background. So, institutionalized racism, a formal definition would be policies, procedures, legislation, and practices of institutions that have a disproportionately negative effect on racial minorities' access to goods, services, and opportunities. Um, so this differs from the person-to-person individualized racism that most people are familiar with. Individualized racism is where person A does something that discriminates against person B, or informal group A discriminates against another racial group. Um, Usually, individualized racism is very easy to kind of pinpoint because you see an individual acting, you know their intent, you know their motivations, whereas institutionalized racism isn't always so easy to pinpoint. Which leads me to my next point of explicit versus implicit institutionalized racism. Explicit institutionalized racism are policies and legislation that overtly state and specifically single out a racial minority, and the goal of the legislation is to negatively affect their lives and cause an inequality. So, example of these could be the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, barring Chinese to immigrate to the United States. Another example would be the Indian Removal Act of 1830, another specific legislation that singled out Native Americans and forced them to leave their native lands. Um, Another example of this, obviously, is slavery, which explicitly stated that whites had the power to enslave African Americans until 1865. So, another more recent in the 20th century example of explicit institutionalized racism would be Jim Crow laws, which were enacted in 1877 and continued effectively until 1965. So these Jim Crow laws segregated public spaces, so African Americans could not um, could not eat in the same restaurants, use the same public facilities or public transportation, um, and even government jobs were segregated and schools. Um, so, implicit institutionalized racism is harder to pinpoint because while the legislation or the procedures of the institution do not specifically single out a racial minority, the effect of the legislation is that they negatively and disproportionately affect their lives. So some examples of these could be grandfather clauses, which were local laws passed um, in the wake of the emancipation of the slaves, which were intent the intent was to bar African Americans from voting. And while it didn't explicitly say them, the law, which stated that in order to vote, your grandfather had to be able to vote before the Civil War, made it so that newly freed slaves whose grandfathers were obviously enslaved also and could not vote in these elections, even though they had the constitutional right. Um, Poll taxes and literacy tests were in the same vein in that they disproportionately affected African Americans who were newly free, who did not have money, and were oftentimes illiterate. So they could not pass these tests or pay these taxes and thus could not vote. Another example could be SB 1070, which was a controversial Arizona piece of legislation, which basically stated that police officers had the right to force any person that they arrested, apprehended, or held on account of any crime, um, force them to show documentation proving that they were an American citizen. And while SB 1070 did not single out any racial minority, many people feared that the law implicitly um, enforced racial stereotyping, as police officers could now, based on no real criteria except for race, um, force Latinos and people of Mexican descent to prove their citizenship. Um, Lastly, an example of implicit institutionalized racism could be mass incarceration of African American men. Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, talks extensively about this, and she states that all of the data, the current data, does not show that African Americans commit more crime. In fact, crimes are mostly committed by white males. However, if you look at the racial makeup of the United States prisons, they are predominantly African American. So she argues that this mass incarceration of African Americans is an example of how, while police practices do not explicitly say that they should target African American men, that is actually what is happening, and that is why we have this mass incarceration. Um, so, as you can see, these implicit examples are a little bit harder to define. Um, and also, oftentimes, these legislation, like in the mass incarceration example, do not have the intent of disproportionately affecting a racial minority group's lives. However, that is the effect that they have, or that is the effect they have in practice. So the relationship between these two is very connected, as oftentimes these institutionalized racist policies help to enforce stereotypes and like racial tropes that fuel individualized racist actions. Um, so, why study institutionalized racism? Well, since the Civil Rights Act, or since the Civil Rights Movement, these racist policies have become more implicit than explicit. Um, as with voting rights acts um, in the 1860s, all citizens could have the right to vote, and many civil rights legislation after that in the workplace helped to dismantle these explicit procedures of racism. However, they do still exist in these kind of implicit and vague realms. So, by studying institutionalized racism, we can further identify these harder to see examples of racism in society. And once we identify them, we can have better tools to dismantle them and to call them out and change legislation so that they do not include this type of institutionalized racism in their language, and thus provide equal opportunities for all, no matter what racial identity. So that is my lesson on institutionalized racism, and thank you so much.